"Do not embarrass me tonight." Those were the last words my husband said to me before we walked through the gates of the White House, and by the end of that evening, he would understand exactly how wrong he had been to say them. I remember the marble floor under my heels, the Marines standing like statues at every doorway, and the strange calm I felt while everyone around me buzzed with nerves. I had been waiting almost a year for this moment, and I was not going to let him rush me through it. My name is Meredith Doyle. I am 29 years old, and for nearly 10 years I served as an Army logistics officer, a job most people assume means spreadsheets and supply closets. My husband, Grant, certainly thought so. He used to call me his little quartermaster at parties, and I would laugh along because explaining the truth would have meant breaking an oath I had sworn never to break. Some jobs protect people precisely because nobody knows what they really involve. Grant and I met years earlier at Fort Bragg, back when he still noticed the world around him. He remembered the names of the privates under his command. He stayed late helping junior officers with their paperwork, and he used to tell me I was the smartest person in every room we entered. That man fell in love with substance. Somewhere between his first captain's bars and his eventual promotion to colonel, I watched that man slowly disappear behind ribbons and rank insignia. It started small, the way most erosion does. At barbecues, someone would ask what I did for the Army, and before I could open my mouth, Grant would answer for me. "She keeps things organized," he would say with a grin, and the group would chuckle like he had told a joke. His mother made it worse at holidays, introducing him as one of the Army's rising stars while gesturing toward me almost as an afterthought. The one who does logistics, whatever that means. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself for years, actually, because my father, who wore the uniform for 3 decades, always said the best officers chase responsibility instead of applause. I tried to live by that even as Grant stopped asking about my day, assumed every late night was paperwork, and never once wondered why I sometimes vanished for a week without explanation. He never imagined those missing weeks might decide whether soldiers overseas came home alive. The real distance began after Grant pinned on Lieutenant Colonel. I was thrilled for him, genuinely, until I noticed he had started introducing himself by rank before his own name. At a retirement dinner near Arlington, a retired colonel asked what I did, and Grant answered before I could speak. "Nothing exciting," he said. "She makes sure people get their supplies." The old colonel just smiled at me and said that usually means you know where every skeleton is buried. I told him we try to prevent skeletons. Grant did not laugh. On the drive home that night, Grant accused me of trying to upstage him in front of his colleagues, and I remember staring out the window instead of arguing because arguing had stopped being worth the energy. Silence became my strategy. I did not realize yet that silence, given enough time, starts to look like permission, and permission is exactly what Grant took from every quiet evening I let slide without a word of protest. Months later, I was selected for a joint task force spanning 4 branches of the military and several civilian agencies, work that required new clearances and long stretches inside secure facilities where phones were not allowed. When Grant asked what I was working on, I told him I could not say, and he rolled his eyes and muttered something about bigger spreadsheets. At his family dinner that week, his mother said she was glad at least one of them had a career people could actually understand. I reported to the Pentagon that following Monday, and did not really surface again for months. My days became satellite maps, evacuation routes, fuel depots, and briefings that stretched past midnight. Grant barely noticed the hours I kept. At one dinner party, someone congratulated him on his latest evaluation, then politely asked how my work was going, and Grant laughed before I could answer, warning them not to get me started, or I would convince them logistics ran the entire Army. That autumn, 2 cream envelopes arrived at our house, each embossed with a seal that made my stomach turn in very different directions. Grant tore his open first and shouted that we had been invited to the White House, then immediately called his mother, his brother, and 2 friends from his old command to share the news. He never noticed there was a second envelope underneath his, addressed only to me, carrying different instructions and a different arrival protocol entirely. I read every line of my invitation twice, folded it carefully, and slid it into the back of my desk drawer without telling him it existed. That night at dinner, Grant polished his medals and rehearsed which generals he hoped to meet, calling it the biggest night of his career. I looked at him for a long moment and thought, quietly, that he had no idea how wrong he was. He never heard me say it because I never said it out loud. Which brings us back to that hallway beneath the chandeliers, Grant hissing at me to stay close and smile on cue, completely unaware that I was carrying the real invitation in my my handbag. When the young hostess scanned my card instead of his, her smile faltered, then vanished. She glanced past me toward a decorated admiral standing nearby and said quietly that I had arrived. He turned, saw me, and crossed the room like the rest of the party had stopped existing. "Colonel Doyle," he said warmly, shaking my hand, "we have been looking forward to meeting you in person." Grant went pale beside me, stammering out a question nobody answered. A protocol officer appeared moments later to inform him his seat was elsewhere entirely, separate from mine, and for possibly the first time in our marriage, my husband had absolutely nothing to say. I offered no explanation. There had been too many years of silence between us for one hallway to fix it. Inside the East Room, I was seated among cabinet secretaries, joint chiefs, and families of fallen service members, while Grant sat 8 rows back watching senior officers greet me by name. His own commanding general leaned over and asked if he personally knew Colonel Doyle, and Grant answered automatically that I was his wife. The general raised an eyebrow and admitted he had never once mentioned it, a small sentence that seemed to land harder than any medal ceremony could. When the president took the podium, he spoke about Americans whose names rarely make headlines, the planners and logisticians who keep the machine running while others take the credit. Then a satellite image filled the screen behind him, and he described a coordinated evacuation operation that had prevented what could have become one of the worst humanitarian disasters involving American personnel in recent memory. Murmurs rippled through the room. Nobody outside a small circle had known any of it until that moment. One officer led that effort, he said, and consistently refused individual recognition for it. My stomach tightened, even though I already knew what was coming. He looked directly toward my section and asked Colonel Meredith Doyle to join him on stage, and as I stood, the entire room rose into applause around me. Across the crowd, I watched every trace of color drain from Grant's face as he finally understood whose night this had actually been all along. The president explained that thousands of American personnel had been at risk of being stranded overseas, and that because of the operation I coordinated, not a single life had been lost during that evacuation. When I reached the microphone, I told the room I was accepting the recognition on behalf of the mechanics, medics, radio operators, and young enlisted soldiers who never get their names read aloud, because they were the actual reason anyone made it home safely. Afterward, during the reception, senior officers and cabinet officials I had only ever spoken to through secure video calls stopped to shake my hand and tell me it was good to finally meet the person behind the voice. A Navy captain mentioned his grandson now wanted to become a logistics officer because of what I had said on stage, and that comment meant more to me than the medal now resting in its case. Eventually, I found Grant standing alone near a window overlooking the south lawn, all his earlier confidence gone. "I did not know," he said quietly when I approached. I told him I was aware. He kept going, insisting he thought logistics simply meant paperwork, and I asked him plainly whether that was really what he had believed about my work for years. He closed his eyes and admitted he had been wrong, and that he had embarrassed himself that night. I told him gently that he had embarrassed himself long before that night, and his shoulders dropped as though the words confirmed something he already suspected. "I never really saw you," he admitted, and that single sentence hurt more than every dismissive joke he had ever made at dinner parties combined, because it was not cruel, it was simply true, and true things tend to cut the deepest of all. His own commanding general walked over moments later and told Grant, almost gently, that he had known about my work for nearly a year, and that the operation I led had not just saved careers, it had saved lives. "Somehow," he said, "you never noticed the remarkable officer you came home to every single evening." He did not sound angry when he said it. He sounded disappointed, and disappointment from someone Grant respected landed far heavier than anger ever could have. People imagine revenge as something loud, something with shouting and slammed doors and public humiliation. Standing in that hallway with a medal I never asked for, I understood that the real reckoning had nothing to do with making Grant feel small. It came from finally seeing myself clearly after years of shrinking quietly so someone else could feel bigger, and that realization felt far more permanent than anything I could have staged on purpose. In the months after the ceremony, I transferred to an Army logistics school in Virginia to mentor young officers, and I discovered I loved teaching almost as much as I had loved the missions themselves. Grant requested a transfer out of his command soon after, enrolled enrolled in leadership counseling on his own, and a mutual friend later told me he never once brought up the White House ceremony, only the day he realized he had stopped listening to the person who knew him best. 8 months later, he texted asking if I would meet him for coffee, no expectations attached, and I agreed. We sat by the river without uniforms or medals between us, talking about my students and his new unit, laughing about our first cramped apartment near Fort Bragg where the air conditioner never worked properly. Near the end, he pulled out an old photograph from our graduation, 2 young officers grinning at a future neither of us could have predicted, and admitted he missed those 2 people. I told him gently that we should not want to become them again, only better versions moving forward, and he looked surprised by that answer before nodding slowly. Whether our marriage ultimately survived matters far less than what each of us learned separately. Grant became a humbler officer, I became a steadier woman, and neither of us ever again confused a title with a person's actual worth. Never underestimate the quiet person standing beside you at the dinner table, because the ones who ask for the least attention are often carrying the heaviest responsibility of everyone in the room. Ribbons fade, uniforms eventually get folded into storage, and medals collect dust in a drawer somewhere, but character is the one thing people actually remember years later. Sometimes the person standing silently at your side is not small at all. They are simply disciplined enough never to announce their own importance.